if you got a handout on your way in, we're going to open it up. Pretty straightforward what we're going to try to accomplish. But let me take you through the 3 sessions we're going to have real briefly, and then we'll start right into the first one. The 3 sessions are going to deal with those pages 8 and 9 there are on the attributes of God, what are called his incommunicable and communicable attributes. The middle pages there, our second session, is going to be on God as our sovereign, and in contrast then God as our Father and the tension that we enjoy between those. And then the last session that we'll have will be trying to balance the conceptual deep end of the swimming pool, that God is one and simple, and that God is 3 and mysterious. Then at the end of your booklet, you see you've got some questions there. We'll probably take those and expand those a little bit more and put them out in another PDF, but all this will be online. And if you're watching this, I think you can go to our website and click through to get this booklet right now. If not, sorry about that. So let's start with this first concept about the attributes of God. There's a lot of different ways of describing who God is, what God is like. One of the more common ways of describing God's nature is to talk in 2 separate categories. Those attributes of God that he does not share with us. If you think of a communicable disease is a disease that can be shared with someone else. God has aspects of who he is that we just don't participate in. And we're going to look at some of them. The right-hand page is the concept of God's communicable attributes, those ways in which God is like us, but not. So let's dive right into those, and we're going to start with this concept that God is very unlike us. These are his incommunicable attributes. And another way of defining that, this key word, is that God can be described in ways that people will never be. If you think about our original dilemma from the garden and on, it was this hope or threat, really, depending on how you look at it, from the serpent. You will be like God. It wasn't fruit, ultimately, that was desired. It was this capacity we'd have not to be creatures, but to be like the Creator. And that rebellion is one we can purge. We read from Isaiah chapter 40. Psalm 86 makes the same kind of statement. There is none like you among the gods, O Lord, nor are there any works like yours. Now that flies in the face of what we as American evolutionists essentially believe about ourselves. But it's not just some scientific thing. It's a philosophical rebellion that we as people have. We want to aspire to, we want to climb our little Tower of Babel and get to the spot that we can ascend to the heavens. We can be like God. And so this idea that God possesses traits that are not like us in the world, I wrote it this way: the idea that God has a nature that is incommunicable, that God's existence is on one level inconceivable to us or incomprehensible to us. It offends the idea that we are capable of knowing all things. Who is the fundamental being in all of the universe? It is God. And when you think of God, if I asked you to take 30 seconds and draw me a picture of God, you'd recognize the tension between your desire to draw something you'd want to draw and your inability to draw something that you know would be a full representation of God. Those things are both inside you. You would want to draw something that would make God palatable, inviting, appealing to you, and at the same time, you would also recognize that can't draw a picture of God. When you think of God, though, particularly we Westerners, we probably have some white-haired image of a man. And on some level, that's okay. God has communicated about himself in ways that sound somewhat anthropomorphic. We talk about the arm of God not being too short. Well, all that means is that God has capacity. It doesn't actually mean he has an arm. But we like keeping God in a box. We like the idea of God being very close and very familiar And these concepts about God are completely, radically different than anything about us. Think of these 5 that I've listed out here. We are, and this first is not necessarily a separate attribute. So much of what we're doing in describing God is like trying to piece out the ingredients of a casserole. It all just is one element. So God is infinite. We are finite. We are limited people, but there isn't any limitation that we have as a part of creation that God is then subject to. So that conceptually is a lot harder to grasp than the concept is to write down on paper. But if you think that through, if my 2 kids go into the room, separate rooms, and start talking to me at the same time, they're going to get into an argument, if not with each other, with me, because I'm going to be frustrated because I can't talk to both of them at the same time. I'm one guy, I've got one set of ears, though 2, they don't work independent, and I can only kind of focus as best I can. There's no point in history that ever happened to God. There's no single point in history where God's presence was limited because we encountered something of his presence here in church, and that doesn't mean there was less capacity for him to be on the other side of the planet or right around the corner. The infinite nature of God is summed up in certain ways, and this is just the best way to start, this concept that there is no one with whom we can compare God, that we should be like him, says the Holy One. If you try to put this idea of God being infinite into a number of different ways in which he's specifically different than us, think about it this way. None of you are wearing diapers. Why are none of you wearing diapers? Because you have changed. You came into the world with a certain obvious immaturity. Ever since that point in time, you've increased your ability to do a number of different things, not because you chose to do them differently, but because you are absolutely incapable. You are people who change. God, to look at our second one, is immutable. He is unable to have any mutation that would ever alter or change him. There's no way God could ever get smarter, get bigger, get older. There's nothing you do or say or think that gives him more data about you. He doesn't improve, ever. Aren't you glad that you're not God in this sense? That the state you arrived into the world isn't your permanent state? Or if we just think about your current state, aren't you glad that God is not like us and that your permanent state isn't what you're fixed in? If I said, this is you forever, your struggles with sin forever, your current knowledge of the world forever, that would be a curse. But for God, it's an amazing statement that makes him worthy of our worship and worthy of our praise. We change, he doesn't. He is not like us, thirdly, in the sense that we are unbelievably dependent. We've entered dependent. We live in a world he made. We are subject to laws and principles that he dictated. Our bodies were given to us. If you have lovely eyes, you really can't boast about it because you never colored them. You never did anything to them. You just have the eyes you were given. Why? Because you are dependent. God, in a very different way, is self-sufficient. He is independent and he is without any cause. He, as Acts 17 says, he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything else. This is the God who made the world and everything in it. Acts 17:24 says he's not served by human hands as though he needed anything. This is our God. He is absolutely independent of any help. He's absolutely dependent of any needs. He has absolutely no beginning point. We, fourth, were created. God is absolutely eternal. Think about this definition. He has no start or end. That we can kind of put together in our mind. But God has absolutely no succession of moments. That's the way Wayne Grudem phrased it. That one blew my mind a little bit. Okay, we can kind of think through the fact that God never started, and we realize from the beginning we don't really understand that. We have a certain sense that God will never end, and we can kind of understand that. But the fact is, you've been here for a while, 37-ish minutes. You have a history, a succession of moments that have happened in chronological order since you arrived. You have a past, you will have a future, and God is completely different from you in that there are no succession of moments in his existence. He is a being who is eternal. And we're created. This concept of God, it shows this definition of God. It's so hard to put words to it, which is why Sproul says the most significant thing we can understand about God is his inconceivability, to quote Princess Bride. His incomprehensibility. When you say God, you have 3 letters you've put together that represents to you an idea. Maybe the best idea that you could actually envision about who God is to say he's a being that there could never be a better being than him. But beyond that, how would you define God? It's incredibly different than trying to define us. We don't understand each other really well, but there's stuff we kind of get and there's stuff we kind of work with. Our ability to define and to describe God it's beyond our comprehension. It's beyond our conception. And yet God is at the same time still knowable. He's the creator. We're the creatures. We don't quite get him. We don't fully understand him. He is, in this sense, then also immense. We don't think of that word necessarily as something that we describe to God. We might describe it to your old uncle who's gaining a little bit too much weight or something along those lines. But the way that we think of God's we think of each other's immensity is all in comparison. This guy is immense compared to this person. He's not so immense compared to that one. An elephant is immense compared to a mouse, but not so immense compared to a brontosaurus. God's immensity is completely unlike us because we are spatial. There is a certain degree to which we can look in this room and we can go 3 dimensions with it, and we can say there is height, there's width, there's depth. And yet what we understand about God is that there's no yardstick for him. There's no moment. And as you're trying to think this through, right, you're going to the universe, probably. He's as big as the universe, which means that you're defining his immensity in proportion to what he's already created, which then, like his eternality, starts to mess with our minds when we recognize there are no bounds or limits. And even your capacity to think about bounds and limits is bounded by the fact that you're created by him. If we just take some time, and when you guys are together in groups, just take some time to bake your noodles together a little bit. Take some time to pray through some of these concepts. And when you come to the end, read Isaiah 40. The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable, and he gives power to the faint. And yet, though we can't fully get him, what he says is, be still and just know I'm God. And that'll be enough for you. it's similar to the way that God talks about his love, right? He's talking to the Ephesians and he says, here's the thing I want you to know. I want you to do as much as you can to grasp that God's love for you is ungraspable. That's a good definition of what it means for us to be in relationship with God. And in the same way, though his love is limitless towards us, in the same way, his whole character, his whole being, his whole nature, all of his attributes are, in this sense, very, very unlike us. But if God is truly incomprehensible, here's the question for review at the bottom. And yet he still makes himself known. Why would we not spend our lives pursuing him? Why would we get to the end of whatever we got to the end of? Reading through your Bible in a year and think, well, I finished it. If we truly understand these attributes and this category of these attributes, there's no way we ever come back to God and say, well, that was kind of dull. That was kind of boring. And yet God isn't just so very unlike us. There are ways in which God, having made us in his image, has bestowed some of his character into us so that we can understand him as, to look at the second page, like us, but not. Or to just say it this way, God can be described in ways, but not degree, that we partly imitate. There's no way you can ever imitate the immensity of God or his eternality. He's just very unlike him. But there are just five ways that we are kind of like God. Just think of these. These are all, there are different categories of God's communicable attributes that are out there for theologians. Some are related to his nature and his being. Some are related to his capacity. What I've picked are moral attributes. So you and I can be decent, but God's good. You and I can be selfless, but God is love. You and I can be purified, sanctified, but God is holy. You and I can be fair, but God is righteous. You and I can be angry, but God is wrathful. And the difference, the chief difference, though we imitate things about God, the chief difference between us and God is that in no case, in no attribute, whether it's moral, whether it's about our capacity and our intelligence and God's superiority with his wisdom and his knowledge, with any of them, God's always the standard. And if you accept that fact, you've again flown in the face of what the world would want to claim. How many times have you heard or read or seen somebody make a statement like, I could never worship a God who would fill in the blank? Or how many times have you been tempted even to say that? What's the major treason that we're committing there? It's not this sense that we want to take the throne over. It's the sense that's behind it. But it's the sense that we want to stand there and be able to evaluate God as though we have a better definition of goodness than God. Or we have a better sense of fairness and justice than God. Because God, if we understand his attributes right, particularly these communicable ones, we have a sense of what's good. We just don't have the definition. We have a sense of what's just and fair, but we don't have a definition. The definition is always God. Does that make sense? So if God is good, then he is the standard of what is worthy of praise. If God is love, then he has no limitations that as he gives himself to others. If God is holy, then he's separate from sin and dedicated to his own glory. Right? Peter said that we are a holy people. And what he meant by that wasn't that we were set apart for some sort of abstract, holy, purified cause. He means you're set aside for me, because I'm the definition of holy. And so if you're to come to me, then you must be holy too, because he is the standard of holiness. Just like he's the standard of righteousness. He defines what's right, and he acts that way. And he is the standard of wrath. Now, book giveaway. this is called good and angry. If you feel comfortable with your level of anger towards others, do not pick up this book. If you would like to think about how to be angry well and how to purge out of you selfish anger, this is a book. It's going to increase your prayer life, is probably what it's going to do. It's a well-written book. David Pallison? This is David Pallison. Very good book. But what the foundation of this book isn't just counseling jargon, and it's far more than that. It's fundamentally this. There are ways that Jesus would get angry in a situation, and we want to be just like that. And there are ways that Jesus would never get angry, and we want to avoid those moments. He talks about, his opening illustration is he sees a mom and her kid at the supermarket, and if you've ever been this mom and kid, sorry, I don't think you're the one in this book. But the kid was having a temper tantrum because it wasn't getting what he wanted. The mom was embarrassed because her kid's behavior was embarrassing her. And so the kid's really angry. And then the mom is just laying on the guilt, laying on the shame, and just terrorizing the kid's conscience in the middle of everything. And so Pallinson's saying there were 3 people angry in that supermarket. This kid who wanted everything, this mom who wasn't acting selflessly, and I hope he could actually make this statement. He said, there was something angry in me. And I tried to catch myself, but I think Jesus would have been similarly angry. I was angry at sin. I was angry that this relationship was being ruined, and I wanted to do something. I wanted to act with righteousness. We're not called to simply be nice, kind, sweet, palatable people. Why? Because we're kind of like God. We're made in his image. We're his standard bearer out there. And people wonder, what happens when sin occurs? And God is, point 5, wrathful. He has hatred for sin that is ultimate and that is intense. For sake of time, I'm going to let you guys go through some of the scriptures that are there. I would really encourage you to read through these. Additionally, in the back, in some of the questions, I put them under section 2, but I asked this question. When you think of the many other attributes of God that we didn't cover, like his perfection, beauty, spirituality, his knowledge, his wisdom, his jealousy, his mercy, his truthfulness, his blessedness, etc., how does knowing God as your Father propel you to study, imitate, and worship him? So here's the amazing thing about being made in the image of God. 1, you were made, and so there are ways you're not like God. But you were made in his image, and so there's ways you can be. People don't know God in this world. People walk through grocery stores just being hurt and getting angry and hurting right back. People go through the world thinking that if they trade off good things for bad things, that God will somehow, or whoever, so whatever higher power, will somehow, the karma of the universe will make things right for them. They don't know God, and you do know God, and you get to be like God. And so when you get sinned against, and when you struggle, and when you work hard, and when you imitate these communicable attributes of God, you're saying to people, this could be your God. We should never tire of getting up and meeting this God. Question I put at the end. Since God is so much higher than I am in these moral attributes, what events could tempt me to question his purposes or his capacity for good? Because every day something happens that disappoints you. Every day you see one of your limitations, and every day the enemy still whispers, you could be like God. He's dropping the ball. He's screwing up. And just like banks don't study counterfeit money, they study the real, so they see the counterfeit. The more we study God and the more we understand God, the more we hear those counterfeit lies as counterfeit lies, and we recognize, no, though my life isn't very good right now, though he's not treating me well right now, though this was disappointing and I didn't get what I wanted right now, my God is still good because I have filled my mind with his communicable attributes, with his incommunicable attributes, and I want to know him and I want to love him. This is why we aim to study God. We're never going to get him, but we're always going to be amazed that we can't, and we're going to be privileged to stand in for him. So.